This is the kind of story people whisper about in late-night diners and in pews after Mass. A small town shaken, a single desperate act, and something no one could explain. Stick with me. This one will make the hair on your arms stand up. If you like what you hear, please like and subscribe so you don't miss future stories like this. Hit the bell, tell a friend, and share. Your support helps these tales reach people who need them. And if you want our pastor to pray for you or your family, leave a comment with your name and the names of the relatives you'd like him to pray for. We read them every night. Nobody in Millersfield ever thought the quiet Valley Road could be the stage for something that would split the town into before and after. The first two sentences people told one another in the diner, at the post office, in the pews were always the same. I saw the smoke. I heard the crack. Those were honest, sharp things like a fist on a table. After that, the explanations multiplied. Anger, misunderstanding, a man full of grief. But the smoke itself, rising at dusk from the churchyard statue, is what everyone remembered most. A slender column that turned the sky the color of old photographs. There's a tremor in small towns that strangers mistake for gossip. In Millersfield, it was weathered by farm hands and school teachers alike. The town sat in a pocket of maples and cornfields, a few hundred souls with a single grocery, a feed store, and St. Agnes, the little stone church that had been there longer than anyone's grandparents. St. Agnes kept the winter bread drives and the funeral casseroles. Statues of saints stood in the garden like permanent company. Faded, moss-streaked, the Virgin Mary with hands folded, a soft stone halo. To most people, she was a comfort, a familiar shape on a Sunday drive home. To others, she was nothing at all. And to one man, on one brittle October evening, she became a symbol of everything he could not bear to hold inside. People who knew him called him Yusuf, because that was his name, and names matter in town stories. He was in his 30s, with work-worn hands from an uncle's construction business and a careful way about him when he spoke. Yusuf had come to Millersfield 3 years earlier, not as a tourist, but as a refugee of quiet reasons. A sublet, a job, then a tidy little apartment above a bakery. He prayed in his own way at night, kept his traditions private, and for the most part people said hello and left it at that. Millersfield didn't ask many questions. It preferred rhythm and habit. But habits bend when grief arrives. The thing about grief is it does two jobs at once. It shrinks the world and it distorts it. For Yusuf, grief was a press that came after a loss the town barely understood. His sister had died overseas, a death tangled in paperwork and distance, then a letter that came late and cold. The letter said things Yusuf could not make fit. Apologies in a language translated poorly, names of people who were supposed to have helped, a final photograph of a child he had never seen. People in town noticed him at the bakery more often, his orders a little quieter, his gaze traveling past faces into a place inside where no one could go. One night, under a sky that smelled like the end of summer, Yusuf walked the path by Street Agnes and did something that would change all of their lives. He set a thing on fire. The statue's wooden base, a little constructed platform where flowers and candles were left, caught first, the flames licking at paper offerings and ribbons. It was not a grand blaze. It was the kind of small, furious ritual people perform when they want to make their pain visible. But fire moves, and stone remembers the heat. The bronze rosary looped over the statue's hands blackened. Someone saw a single shoe on the path afterward, a pale slipper with a ribbon burned away. The town woke to smoke and a handful of ashes, and a silence heavy as winter. When people talk about that evening, they always insist on three things: how the pastor found the charred candle remnants, how Mrs. Gibbons from the diner brought out hot coffee for the officers, and how Yusuf's face was not easy to read. He didn't run. He didn't argue. He stood with his hands in his pockets while the police took notes and the pastor knelt and inspected the statue, cradling the scorched rosary with a tremor in his voice. It was a sacrilege, someone said. It was a cry. Both were true. Millersfield took it as an affront, because that's how communities keep themselves whole, by taking violations against what they hold sacred very seriously. Almost immediately, the town felt itself leaning the wrong way. It is always the small omens that people remember first. The town's old mill pump that had worked for generations sputtered and coughed and then failed. The high school football team lost its practice field to a freak flood the next week, even though the rains had been light. Mrs. Delaney's prize roses wilted overnight. Superstition rides in on the heel of coincidence, and Millersfield is old enough to have learned the language of signs. People started dreaming odd dreams, of water where there had been none, of a woman's face half buried in fog, of a lullaby hummed by someone who was not there. The pastor, Father Tom, began to keep late hours at the rectory, answering the phone and listening to callers who were frightened, who wanted prayers said. If you leave a comment with your name and the names of your relatives, he told the congregation at Sunday service, and he meant it, we will pray by name. It was both pastoral care and an appeal to communal memory. Names make things real. Rumors swelled like tidewater. Some said Yusuf had been angry at the sight of the statue because someone in town had told him tales of priests who judged, of families who would not rent him. Others insisted he was merely broken. Children at the school drew pictures that looked like smoke and halos. A woman in the feed store claimed her radio cut out when she walked by St. Agnes, and that when the power came back, the news said nothing of it, which made her think the world was hiding things. The feed store woman's husband, who fixed small engines for a living, said quietly that pigeons were congregating on the church roof in numbers like a gray rain. Miller's Field's veterinarian shrugged and said birds did what birds do, but the stories kept their teeth. There was history here, too, older than anyone who lived now, older than the Protestant and Catholic lines that threaded through gossip. St. Agnes had a story in its ledger of unexplained healings from almost a century before, a boy who woke from a coma after a priest laid hands on him, a midwife who said the Virgin statue had looked down and smiled during a hard birth. Those entries were neat and dutiful, written in a hand long gone. Grandpa Hutchinson would pull the ledger from the rectory shelf with gloves and a sense of ceremony and say, "We don't talk much about what time keeps for us, but it keeps it." People who remember the ledger were divided. Some said miracles had always been part of Miller's Field, tucked like clover in the lawn. Others said those records were quaint misreadings of chance. But the ledger mattered because it told the town what it could be, a place that believed things beyond explanation, or a place that did not. Then the accidents began, the sort that have faces and names. First, a delivery driver skidded on black ice that wasn't supposed to be there, miraculously unharmed but shaken. Then, a week after the statue burned, old Mr. Galloway's mule became spooked and bolted through a fence he'd mended 3 times a spring. The mayor's son came home from college for a weekend and, while driving late on the valley road, missed a turn he'd made 100 times before and clipped the guardrail, a dent in the car and a bruise on the ego. People cataloged these events as if they were inventory, stacking them into a pile that pointed to something. Some said the town was simply unlucky. Others paced, looking for a pattern. Not everyone in Miller's Field wanted a pattern. Lucia, the school nurse, kept a list of who had been kind to strangers and who had not, simple citations of human decency, and she said aloud that the world didn't always answer to anger, and that sometimes the only thing that could bind a town was the decency you practiced the next day. But decency is often the slow medicine in a town facing a fast fear. A group of parishioners began to keep vigil at night at St. Agnes, lighting candles and muttering the rosary. They were joined, quietly, by teenagers with flashlights and by a man from the mosque in the next county who said little and stood with his hands clasped. The vigil's presence steadied some people and unnerved others. Yusuf did not join the vigil. He did not come to the church to apologize or to explain. He went about his work in a way that suggested the world was not needing anything from him. And then one ordinary morning, a crisp, clear day when the corn stalks clacked like a dry crowd, he walked across the highway near the feed store. He had groceries in a sack and a look like someone who was counting steps because the world had become hard to hold. The truck that hit him came around a blind bend, driver distracted, not drunk, just human and unfixed. The sound was a snap and a scream, and then the quiet that follows the thing that cannot be undone. They took him to St. Mercy Hospital, the kind of place with linoleum floors and a night nurse who knows everyone's family because she used to be on the PDA. Father Tom drove in a hurry, and Mrs. Gibbons brought a thermos of coffee for the waiting room. The pastor stood at the far end of a corridor under a fluorescent light that buzzed like a distant hive, watching the doors of the trauma bay. No one knew if Yusuf would live. He lay on a gurney with his eyes blown by shock. The grocery sack split open with a head of lettuce like a small green flag. Someone found a matchbook in his pocket from a gas station in a town 2 counties over. The news vans, which had been quiet since the arson, smelled the story and gathered like gulls at the edge of a pier. Inside the trauma room, machines blinked. Nurses worked with a crisp choreography. Father Tom whispered a prayer that sounded like a rope thrown into deep water. The hospital chaplain paged the imam from the larger town, because even in the middle of something raw, people thought of small courtesies. Outside, the town murmured and waited, like a hand pressed to a window, waiting for the first breath after a storm. Someone remembered the ledger. Someone else remembered the pigeons. The air felt electric with things left unsaid. And there, with a breath held by dozens of strangers, the vigil, the imam, the pastor, Mrs. Gibbons, the driver who had not wanted this, and the boy from the feed store who had watched everything. The story paused. Miller's Field had reached the hinge where a single night could swing their lives into new light or flatten them into silence. The gurney rolled into the surgery suite, and the doors closed like a promise. People outside the doors did not move. That is where the town stopped and held its collective breath, and where, for me, the telling of the story must pause, because the next thing was the kind of thing people either believe or they don't. There were silences, then whispers, then a step that no one could explain clearly, not without sounding foolish. The nurses exchanged looks. Father Tom prayed louder. The driver made the sign of the cross in a hurried, uncertain way. Mrs. Gibbons' coffee went cold in her hands. The machine in the hall ticked. Someone in the waiting room said, softly, "I saw a woman last night, standing at the church," and the room leaned forward, ready for the next movement in a story that was only beginning. The waiting room smelled of coffee gone cold and antiseptic, and voices that normally wandered in polite circles had narrowed into a single, sharp current. When someone said, "I saw a woman last night, standing at the church," the sound was not like gossip. It was a confession you might make to a priest because you needed to be forgiven or because you needed someone else to witness that you had seen something impossible. Heads turned. Old men who spent their evenings balancing checkbooks in the library blinked hard. Teenagers who had come with sour-faced bravado softened, their bravado sliding off like wet coats. That night after the accident, Millersfield's usual rhythm snapped. People went home and could not sleep. They kept thinking of Yusuf's figure on the road, groceries spilled like small casualties of life, and the little statue that had been blackened the week before. Stories opened like wounds where they had been stitched long ago. A woman named Ellen, who worked the night shift at the diner, swore she had driven by St. Agnes on her way home and seen, framed by the church's stained glass, a pale shape standing where the statue had been. Not a man, not a child, but a silhouette like a memory of someone wearing a shawl. She said the shawl was the color of moonlight. She called Father Tom in the morning before her shift because the sight stuck at the back of her mind like a splinter. Father Tom, who listened to so many small emergencies, his voice had come to be a place where people put their troubles down, found himself left with a set of questions that had blunt edges. He began to remember the ledger again, the neat entries and fading ink about odd healings and sudden consolations. The ledger was a map of rumor and wonder. It did not prove, but it reminded. He called for a prayer meeting at the church and asked everyone who wanted to be together to bring a candle. The turnout was more than he expected. Farmers, the mayor, the nurse from the school, a couple of teenagers who wanted to see if faith was still dramatic or just polite. A man from a mosque in the county over who had stood at the vigil a week earlier arrived and stood at the back, quiet and solid as a wall. Millersfield had always known how to gather when given a reason. Inside St. Agnes that night, the candles made islands of light on the cold stone floor. People whispered their fears like secrets, afraid that saying them loud would make them true. Mrs. Gibbons, who could not set a pot of soup down without expecting someone to tap her on the shoulder, folded her hands so hard her knuckles showed white. Father Tom read passages that had seen him through storms. Psalms, small prayers that had always fit in the pockets of the town. The man from a mosque, his name was Amir, spoke softly in Arabic. The words were not a translation of the prayers Father Tom read, but they carried the same warmth. When he finished, no one in the pews felt as if a difference had been drawn between them. Faith, for the night, was a common garment. Outside, the air felt like it carried messages. That night the sky was clear and the moon was a thin coin, and people kept hearing sounds they could not place. The rustle of church flags, a distant dog that kept repeating the same worried note. Young people who were not sure they believed anything more than the weather reported dreams that were thicker than usual. A woman with hands both calloused and gentle, hands that soothed fevered foreheads or steadied a plow. Some woke with the scent of lilies in the air, though there were no lilies to be found. An old farmer said he woke at dawn to find that a line of his fence posts, which had been leaning for years, stood suddenly straight. It was the small things that made people think the world had edged toward them. Hospital shifts turned in their small choreography. The nurses rotated in tired cycles, but the watchers in the waiting room shrank into a kind of vigil. Father Tom sat occasionally and prayed aloud, but mostly he waited. In the trauma unit, surgeons moved like a team of high-functioning machines and did not speak of anything beyond the tasks in front of them. They were, in a way, like the rest of the town, professional people who handled pain and did not offer opinion. But when they finished their work and wheeled Yusuf into intensive care, there was an hush that felt bigger than grief. The machines that breathed for him clicked on and off with steady indifference. The next morning, the story of the night spread beyond the town's borders. A regional reporter came with a camera crew because stories that mix religion and danger travel faster than gossip. He asked questions in blunt, calculated ways. Any suspects? Is this domestic? Have you had similar events here before? He left with footage and a cautionary tone, as if to warn the world. Small towns are volatile when the sacred meets the secular. A few callers to the news station insisted the town was being hysterical. Others called in with soft, halting testimony about dreams and birds and the old ledger. The internet, which had not yet learned how to be gentle, collected the impressions and multiplied them, splintering the town's quiet into comments and hot takes. In the hospital room where Yusuf lay, the light at the foot of the bed sometimes shifted as if someone with a slow hand were dimming a lamp. Nurses said he slept without sound. His skin was patched with bandages and his face was hollowed by pain into something like a question. Father Tom and Amir held a quiet space at the chair by his bed. They did not ask for confession. There was no need for that. Yusuf, when he awoke, would have a man who could translate for him, but language sometimes fails where heartache is too big to fit in words. Then the dreams turned into something that people could not dismiss as private. A nurse named Claire, who had seen 1,000 injuries and the innumerable ways humans put themselves back together, was the first to break the rule of the room and speak of what she saw. It was late, and the ward was in that twilight between night and dawn. Claire had walked in to check on Yusuf because he had a fever climbing stubbornly. She told a friend later that she had felt a wind in the room, though the windows were closed, and that a scent, clean, floral, like the inside of a church that had been scrubbed for a feast, wrapped around the bed. She said she nearly left without speaking because she had always been trained to be practical. But the pressure of the sight pulled her forward. On the east side of Yusuf's bed, a shape had formed. It was not harsh or easily named. Some nurses later called it a silhouette. Others said it was like a reflection. It had the suggestion of shoulders and the sweep of drapery. Claire, who had not been at church since childhood, felt a warmth spread through her palm that had nothing to do with the monitors. She reached out and felt, as she later described it, a surface like cool bronze under a thin veil. She whispered, "Are you?" And then she stopped because words are small when you are standing at the edge of mystery. She is not the only one. A night orderly who set down a tray would later swear he saw the corner of the bed lit by a light that did not come from any lamp. A chaplain from a neighboring county said his watch stopped and then started again as if someone had pressed a button on the world. The most compelling testimony came from Amir. He had been sitting quietly, his hands folded, when he told Father Tom he had seen a woman standing at the foot of Yusuf's bed. Not a nurse, not a shadow, a woman, he insisted. She wore a long robe and a veil, and though the language he used was different, the thing he said in English that evening was plain. She was very sad, but the sadness was like a blessing. Amir's voice did not shake when he said it. It was steady as a stone that has always been in a river. Rumors crystallized quickly. People in the town milked the event for meaning. Some said the appearance was a reprimand for Yusuf's act. Others believed it was a mercy that spoke to the wound the town had inflicted on itself. Debate in the diner grew hot. Should the town forgive? Should Yusuf be punished? Could an act of desecration be answered by a vision of compassion? The legal questions were easier to manage. The moral ones lodged like splinters you could not find with tweezers. Meanwhile, Yusuf lay between waking and sleeping. When he opened his eyes, for a moment he seemed disoriented, as if he were in someone else's life, and then he would settle back into silence. He murmured once, a word in a language many did not understand, and someone translated it clumsily as mother. Hunched in the doorway, Father Tom felt that the entire town had become one patient waiting for confession or miracle. He thought of the ledger again, the paper, the ink, the margins with their small notes. He thought of the parishioners who had brought candles and of the man who had come from a mosque and stood without saying a sermon. He thought of the parishioners who wanted justice and the teenagers who wanted a story bigger than their small lives. As the days progressed, more oddities clustered like moths around a porch light. Pigeons that used to scatter from the church roof now perched there in silent rows. A neighbor found a row of tiny white stones laid at the base of the blackened statue, stones that looked ordinary but were warm to the touch, as if the warmth of someone's hand had rested on them earlier. Someone's radio started playing, unbidden, a hymn from 30 years back at the exact moment a mother in town said her child had stopped coughing. A crop of corn near the mill ripened in a pattern that, when viewed from the hill behind the feed store, suggested the curve of a hand. People who had never been to a healing before drove past the hospital at odd hours and peeked through frosted windows to see if anything was happening. Not everyone believed in the story. Some townsfolk wanted a simpler resolution, an apology, a fine, a community reconciliation. That was practical work, heavy but certain. Old Mrs. Delaney, who tended city gardens and loved order, insisted the legal system should take its course. People do things out of heartbreak all the time, she said, brass in her voice. But we have the law for that. There is a comfort in law because it gives the restless a place to stand. But law does not account for the shape of a woman standing in a hospital room at midnight. Then things tilted. Yusuf's temperature climbed and spiked overnight. And in the temporal space between his breathing and the machine's ping, he reached for something that was not there and whispered a name in a voice so clear the fellows outside the room stopped their small talk. The name was not his sister, not a friend. It was an old name, a mother's name some in the town recognized because their great-grandmothers had used it in prayers. A nurse leaned in closer and heard him say, "Mary." The word in that hush felt like a bell rung very softly. That evening, as the town muttered and waited and argued in fragments, a group of volunteers gathered in the church hall and began to knit small things, scarves, little blankets, rosaries threaded with beads from craft box. It is part of human nature to busy hands when minds rattle with fear. They spoke less about the miracle and more about what mercy might look like if it came practical as a blanket over someone's shoulders. The reporter from the region showed up again, asking sharper questions, and sometimes the presence of cameras made people lie, claiming visions they didn't have or describing things in inflated language. Other times it made people tell the truth in ways they might not have otherwise. The boy from the feed store who had been watching from the beginning said he had seen a figure pass the church at dawn and place a single white lily by the base of the scorched statue. The camera recorded him stammering and then falling silent. On the third dawn after the accident, when morning crawled pale and slow across the valley, something happened that moved the town from a place of anxious conjecture to an edge they could not ignore. It began small. A nurse who had been on duty for 12 hours saw, plain as day, a figure bend over Yusuf and lay a hand on his temple. The hand was not rough like a farmer's nor curled like a child's. It was astonishingly ordinary and full of rest. Claire, who had seen the shape earlier, swore under her breath and called Amir. Amir, who knew prayers in 2 languages, crossed himself not in a claim of ownership, but in a startled, human recognition that a border had been crossed between the invisible and the unmistakable. Everything tightened like the string on a bow. People who were nothing like each other found themselves holding the same breath, waiting to see if what they believed would be made small or large. Father Tom felt his heart go steady and then race. A policeman stood at the foot of the hospital stairs with his hands in his pockets because there are no handcuffs for washers of miracles. The machine that had been steady hummed, and then the monitors did something the technicians could not explain. And in that moment, before anyone had a language to put around it, the waiting room became a place where the improbable could come true. But miracles are not tidy. They do not present themselves and then leave with applause. They reach into the messy middle of things and change the score in ways that make sense only after the fact. As the sun rose higher and a light like a promise filtered through the hospital blinds, the room held a suspended hush. Nurses swallowed, hands clenched. Father Tom stepped forward because there are some moments a pastor cannot stand aside from. Amir stood a little to the side, not to watch but to be witness. Claire, who had been practical her whole life, felt something in her breast loosen and then shift. At the very moment when breath and heartbeat seemed to align, when the town itself leaned forward as if to hear a secret, the doors opened and a sound like a small choir of bells came from somewhere outside the walls. People in the corridor paused, and a patient from the next room lifted his head like a man who hears music after a long silence. The light on Yusuf's face, which had been pale and lined, seemed to gather itself into a brightness that none of the fluorescent fixtures could claim. Nurses gasped. Father Tom found himself muttering a prayer that had no words he'd known he could say. And Yusuf, who had been sleeping in a place where life felt fragile, turned his head very slowly and opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, as if reading something written there, and then he looked down, and his gaze met a figure at the foot of the bed. The figure was not a doctor, not a nurse. It had the quiet, undeniable presence of something older than the hospital. The room exhaled as one. Someone in the doorway let out a sound like a prayer and another like a sob. And then Yusuf did something no one had expected. He smiled. That smile was small and complicated and perfectly human. It stopped the clock for the waiting room, the cameras, the morning errands that had been started and then abandoned. But what the smile meant, whether it was merely the relief of surviving an accident or the trace of a deeper reaching mercy, nobody could yet say. People who had been skeptics felt their skepticism unspool. People who had been devout felt a strange, new humility. And in the hush that followed, someone whispered, "Is she there? Is she really there?" The answer, as always, refused to be simple. The shape at the foot of the bed was beginning to be seen by more than one person at a time. A nurse ticked the clock with a hand that trembled and reached for the chart, thinking the numbers would tell her what to feel. The machines kept ticking. In the corridor, a reporter's camera clicked and then went silent, because some things cannot be filmed without something in the frame changing how you see it. People pressed closer to the glass of the ICU door. And that is where the story should pause for breath. Because in the next moments, the hospital room would hold an exchange no one could fully explain, an intersection of mercy and consequence with a man who had started it by setting a small fire a week earlier. The figure at the foot of Yusuf's bed leaned forward in a way that made people easy to tears, and a hush fell that felt like a benediction. Nurses who had never been to Mass and men who had only ever attended Thanksgiving prayer felt the hair on their arms stand up. The town, which had been cataloging accidents and hushed miracles like ledger entries, waited to see whether what came next would be punishment or grace, whether Millersfield would be made new or undone. And then, just as the room seemed to hold the whole valley inside it, Yusuf spoke one word, very softly: forgive. The single word fell into the room like a bell struck slowly. Forgive. It was not shouted. It was not a demand. It was a small, simple request that carried all the weight of a man who had been broken and then, by something he could not explain, made willing to be held together again. For a moment, no one knew how to respond, whether with law, with prayer, with a hand on a shoulder. The cameras outside clicked like a distant storm. Inside, silence had a quality like scripture. Yusuf's voice trembled and then steadied. He turned his head toward the figure at the foot of the bed, as if looking at a mother or a mirror. The figure did not look the way the pictures and church guides look. It was softer, less precise, more like the suggestion of a face remembered. To some she seemed young, to others, lovingly ancient. Her hands were open, palms up. She did not point fingers, and she did not speak with the harshness of those who judge. Instead, she seemed to hold the whole of Yusuf's anger and his grief as if it were something fragile she could set right with patience. What did she say? Father Tom asked, and in his voice was every pastor's private hunger to make sense of the unexplainable. Amir, who had been translating, found himself without words at first. He cleared his throat and told the room that Yusuf had told him later, in a mix of Arabic and the halting English he'd been learning since he moved here, that the woman had shown him his sister. She had put before him one image after another: a small child laughing, a letter with a name scrawled across it, a garden where two hands planted seeds, and in the last image, the two siblings standing together as if time itself had been stitched back. Yusuf had held that vision like a sacrament, and, in it, felt the vastness of what he had lost and the tiny cruelty of what he had done. The nurses said later that in the hour after Yusuf woke, he began to heal in ways that baffled them. A gash that surgeons had said would need weeks to close puckered like a seam and then smoothed. A bruise faded overnight. The bandages peeled away as if the skin beneath had learned how to mend itself. They charted vitals and scowled at numbers that should not have shifted so quickly. Doctors try to keep their language clinical because there is comfort in charts and procedure. The charts, though, read like the margins of a story you might find in old ledgers. Things noted more for wonder than explanation. Word of the shift in Yusuf's condition traveled faster than reason. Pilgrims, people who would drive across counties because hope is contagious, began to appear at the hospital. They came not as a mob, but as people with cupped hands, mothers with children, men in work boots, teenagers who had come for a story and stayed for something that made them quiet. Some left candles at the hospital chapel. Someone slipped a small bouquet of lilies into Yusuf's hands, and he held them like a man who had been given back a language he thought he had lost. The legal part of the story did not vanish because a woman appeared at a hospital bed. The county police, who had handled the arson report, opened a file and set it aside with a sigh of exasperation, and then went about their duty, talked to witnesses, write statements, forward a report to the district attorney. The DA was pragmatic in a way small-town hearts sometimes are not. "We prosecute what is criminal," she said on the phone, and her voice made it clear that mercy and law sit at different tables. Prosecutors do not discount consequences because a miracle is claimed. Yet even the DA, who kept her professional distance, did not want the town to dissolve into spectacle. She asked for restraint from reporters and for people to think of the families involved. Millersfield held two stories at once: the need for justice and the need for healing. And that tension was where the real work began. Father Tom and Amir met with the mayor and a few elders in the church hall. They called a town meeting and invited everyone who wished to speak. What happened that night became the sort of memory that the town would tell and retell in small variations. The auditorium filled. People sat with their coats on because the heaters were slow, and some clapped to make themselves less afraid. When Yusuf was wheeled into the hall, supported by two nurses and the imam from the nearby county who had become a quiet presence, the room hummed with a sound that was part sorrow and part relief. He stood, tentative and new, his legs shaky but true. He looked at the faces of people who had watched the statue burn, at Father Tom with tears burning his eyelashes, at Mrs. Gibbons who would not stop knitting, and at Amir who simply nodded as if to say, "We do not own what the heart gives us." "I am sorry," he said. "I cannot take back what I did. I wish I could have been kinder in my grief." His English was careful, seasoned by embarrassment and remorse. The words landed, and they were small and large at once. Among those who had wanted to make law a blunt instrument, the apology did not excuse him. Some demanded a formal penitence. Others, older women whose knees ached from years of standing in church, saw in Yusuf's voice something that mirrored their own imperfect contrition across decades. What followed was not a single grand gesture, but a slow, communal repair. The parish and the mosque agreed to hold a joint evening of prayer and remembrance by the statue. They asked Yusuf if he would come, and he said yes, if only because he wanted to stand where he had sinned and see if being there made him different. People who had once feared each other sat across from one another and listened as Father Tom read from the ledger, and as Amir recited a prayer in Arabic that translated, loosely, as a wish for mercy on all hearts. Children lit candles. A woman placed a small bowl of water at the base of the statue, simple, clean water, and the gesture felt like a treaty. When they uncovered the statue that night, it was not whole in the way it had been before. The base still bore blackened traces. The rosary, which had been charred, now lay whole in the Virgin's stone hand, as if soot could not claim what had been given. Some said that the rosary had been replaced by an anonymous hand at dawn. Others said it was always there, hidden by the night and the eye. Yusuf knelt and placed his own hands against the statue's stone feet and wept. People stepped forward, not simply to see, but to forgive. The moment was modest and enormous. The town's whole history folded into that small action. In the weeks that followed, life in Millersfield rearranged itself around this new fact. Yusuf, whose injuries had healed quicker than anyone expected, took a job doing maintenance at the feed store. He joined a group that delivered meals to the elderly. He came to the joint prayers sometimes, and sometimes he did not. Being present is its own kind of labor. The boy from the feed store who had watched from the beginning, now a young man who had sketched the statue's face in his notebook, became a quiet friend who found in Yusuf someone who wanted to learn how to be known by others. Not every scar was smooth. There were sharp edges that the town could not sand away. Some people insisted that what happened did not absolve wrongdoing. That an apology could not erase arson. A few left Millersfield, their faith shaken in a way even they could not explain. They moved away and carried the story like a question mark. Others stayed and made new daily practices, an evening of quiet, the ringing of a bell at dusk, a call to the neighbor if someone had not been seen. The town's ledger gained a new note, and Grandpa Hutchinson wrote in the margin with a stooped hand, "Remember the ways mercy and law must cohabit." There were other odd things that kept happening, small, liminal signs that most people chalked up to coincidence, but that some kept in their pockets like lucky coins. A woman's chronic cough eased for a week and returned a month later. A row of young corn bent, as if in a blessing, and then straightened. A dog found a home after wandering for days and would not leave the statue's steps. The pigeons remained, now considered friends instead of bad omens. People lit candles on Wednesdays and Sundays, and more than one person reported a dream where a woman in a shawl smiled and then walked away in a morning light. As for Yusuf, his life did not end with a tidy miracle. He kept the memory of the woman at the foot of his bed like an ember, something small that must be tended. He visited his sister's grave overseas the following year. The trip had been arranged by a neighbor who had worked with a nonprofit. He wrote letters he could not send and learned to listen when people around him told stories of their own losses. He found, in slow increments, the vocabulary for remorse and for giving back in ways that measured up to what he had taken. Years later, children in Millersfield would whisper the story in the same way the old people had whispered the ledger's entries, as evidence that the world is capable of both cruelty and grace, often at once. A little girl who had been born in the year of the accident would put wildflowers at the base of the statue and tell anyone who asked that the Virgin, so she had been taught, was both a caretaker and a warning. The statue itself bore its marks like a map, slight darking where the flames had caught, a faint polish on the stone where hands had been laid in prayer. People who came from far away for reasons of curiosity or devotion would stand and weep quietly, sometimes asking for the pastor to pray for their families. Father Tom, older and with more lines at the corners of his mouth, did so often. He would say the names aloud and, in his small voice, claim them for the town. There are questions the town could not answer. Was a woman at Yusuf's bedside the Virgin Mary? Did she appear because of the burned statue, or because of Yusuf's grief, or because the ledger had been waiting for a night like that to be written in again? Those questions did not have simple answers, and perhaps they never would. What mattered, the people discovered, was not always the answer, but what they chose to do with the possibility of one. In a final small ceremony, months after the events that would be told and retold, the parish and mosque leaders stood together and planted a circle of lilies near the churchyard as an emblem not of victory, but of memory. A plaque was installed with a line that read, quite plainly, "For those who seek mercy, and for those who need to give it." The wording satisfied no one entirely, but that was the point. Mercy is not tidy. It sits in the messy middle. If you found this story moving, please like and subscribe so you won't miss future stories like this. Hit the bell to get notifications, and share this with someone who loves a story that sits with you after it's over. If you'd like our pastor to pray for you and your family, leave a comment below with your name and the names of relatives you'd like included. We read them and pray together every night. Thank you for listening. Thank you for lending your quiet to a town that had to learn, in the way communities always must, that love and consequence can live in the same room. If the hairs on your arms are still standing, keep them. They're a reminder that some things are larger than our everyday reasons. Tell the story to someone else and see what they make of it. Keep your eyes open on quiet roads and in hospital corridors. Sometimes the world reaches in when we least expect it.